Okay, so let's finish this week off with something a little bit more technical. We're going to talk about the way in which Shakespeare uses language. I have hinted at with some of you, and I think even said in the last video, that in some respects I think Mr. Shakespeare has more in common with modern day hip-hop artists than he does with modern day playwrights. Let me try to back up that claim today. Part of the reason why I say that is that Shakespeare is writing in a style called blank verse. And I know that high school lit class, when you talked about this, or let's be honest, when you cliff noted or slept your way through this, was a long time ago, so let's explain that. It's poetry, right? Shakespeare's writing in poetry. His characters are speaking in poetic verse, which means nobody talked like Shakespeare's characters back in the day. They did not walk around, saying things like, "With wings as swift as Mercury's steed, fly this missive to beyond mystery." Yeah, no, they said, would you mail this letter for me, right? They talk like we do. And in some respects, even the vocabulary wasn't particularly enlightened or heightened for most of Shakespeare's audience because, most of them couldn't read. Shakespeare is much more elevated in his language than certainly your common writer, then or now. But yeah, his characters, they're talking in poetry. That is why it sounds the way that it sounds. The kind of poetry that he's writing in is called blank verse. Blank verse is unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter. So, I know, let me run you through that really fast. Okay, an iamb is a rhythmic pattern where you take an unstressed syllable and follow it with a stressed syllable. When you overemphasize it, I am, right? The I gets less stress, the am gets more stress. I am, right? When you take that pattern, unstressed, stressed, that's a foot. When you have 5 of those in one line of verse, that is pentameter, right? 5. So, iambic pentameter is what you get when you have 5 metric feet in a line of verse. Blank verse, what Shakespeare's writing in, are lines of iambic pentameter that don't rhyme. For Shakespeare, you only rhyme at the very end of a scene. That's one of the ways that the audience is clued in that a scene is ending, because a character does a rhyming couplet at the end of a scene. So yeah, Shakespeare's writing in rhythmic verse, not the way that human beings actually talk. He has sections of prose in his plays, but for the most part, what we think of when we hear him is the verse. So yeah, no, people didn't walk around talking like that back then. Their speech might sound a little bit more elevated than ours did, but yeah, the human beings did not walk around speaking the way that most of the characters in Shakespeare's plays speak or sound, because the characters are speaking in poetry, right? There are reasons why this poetic form exists. He's not the one who originated it. There's another playwright, which we will talk about a little bit more next week, named Christopher Marlowe, who comes up with blank verse, and Shakespeare just adopts the style because it's popular at the time. Part of the reason why is that, number one, the actors didn't get much time to rehearse a play before it would premiere. And, the printing press is still relatively new within the first, couple hundred years. And what that meant is that when you are writing something out, like, say, a play script, you're writing it by hand. And then you have somebody copy it. But it's not like, running a copy off the copier or the printer, right? No, somebody has to hand copy it. So, as an actor in a play, you would not get the entire script. You would get just your lines and, like, the lines that cue you in. And that's it. That's all you'd get. And because you're working under a time crunch, yeah, that's why the rhythmic verse is there. So, when you put iambic pentameter into practice, when you put blank verse into practice, and you overemphasize the rhythm, this is what it sounds like. Da-da, 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 right? If you are looking along on the slides, slide 42 gives you an example of a famous line from Romeo and Juliet in blank verse, split up, right? Here, let me walk you through it. I'll tap it out. But soft, but light, through through yon, der wind, no breaks, right? The rhythm is there to help the actor be able to memorize the lines faster and to keep the rhythm of the verse going. And then additionally, there are no such things as directors, not the way that we think of that term, like a film director, you know, a director in film and theater, right? Who tells you how to interpret lines. Directors, in the way that we think of that job, don't exist yet. So part of the reason why the rhythm is there and works the way that it does is that by what words Shakespeare is placing the stress on, he is telling the actors what words they should emphasize when they're acting, right? So yeah, you would not overemphasize the verse when you're actually performing it. You know, overemphasize, but soft. What light through yon, der wind, do breaks. You soften that, but soft. What light through yonder window breaks. Tells you what words to hit, how to emphasize them. Yeah, so Shakespeare is sort of sneaking his directing of actors into just the form of the verse itself. So yeah, we don't write in verse these days. We write in prose. And so accordingly, what Shakespeare's writing, for the most part, with his verse is very concerned with rhythm and flow. So if you think about modern day hip hop, right? If you think about somebody who's really good at freestyling or somebody who's really good at like the flow of a beat or rhyme, an Eminem, Grandmaster Flash, Tupac, somebody like that who's really gifted at playing with language and making it fit within a certain rhythm pattern, that's exactly what Shakespeare's doing. It's just he is working in iambic pentameter, blank verse, right? But yeah, he is much more concerned with rhythm and flow of language and playing with language than, say, what a modern day playwright has to do. So yeah, I guess I'm saying if you like hip hop, you should at least appreciate, not like, but you should at least appreciate that that Shakespeare is doing a lot of the same things because he is working in rhythmic verse and flow the same way that hip hop artists do. Shakespeare's kind of a master at using language. I guess I'll talk more about that maybe next week, but yeah, like his lines are perfect. He only breaks the pattern when there's a reason to break it. There's a very famous speech in Hamlet when Hamlet is deciding whether or not to off himself, to be or not to be. That is the question. You know, you've heard that before. If you hit the rhythm out with that, there is a reason why it works the way it works. To be or not to be, that is the question. And that extra syllable hangs out there, and it's like a tip to the actor that, yeah, it's a moment where you should pause on the end of that word. And for the audience listening, that pause that's created by the extra syllable will make that line more meaningful and significant. Yeah, Shakespeare's kind of a master at language and using it with this rhythmic pattern. So yeah, I used to be one of those people who was idiotic back when I didn't know anything and was like, who cares about the verse? You should care about the verse because it kind of tells you everything you need to know. It's a starting point, certainly, as an actor doing Shakespeare. You know, you're speaking in poetry, but you know, for a modern audience, you certainly can't sound like you're speaking in poetry. You have to make it feel real. I hate to use that word, but you know, realistic, like realistic dialogue. And so, yes, the verse is a starting point, and it gives you a lot of hints for how to approach delivering lines. And so, it's a worthwhile thing to at least acknowledge. By the way, also their dialect. Shakespeare was from the country. A lot of actors at the time, they were not high-born, highbrow sort of English people. They were lower class usually. So, you know, imagine, you know, your most miserable memory of watching or hearing Shakespeare done with those, you know, fruity Downton Abbey British accents. You know, why man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus. Yeah, that is not how they sounded, right? They sounded more countrified, believe it or not. So I'm not, you know, saying that it was as thick as to be or not to be, because that just makes me want to die inside. But that's closer to how they sounded. The Opening prologue to Romeo and Juliet, two households both alike in dignity in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. Yeah, that would have actually sounded closer to something like two households both alike in dignity in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. Like, it would be more countrified. So yeah, get the, you know, stiff ass, super posh, crisp British dialect out of your head. That's not how they sounded. They sounded closer, in some ways, to Southern dialect from the American South. Anyway, yeah, that's enough of that for this week. Next week, we're going to talk about the reason why he's worth knowing about, briefly walking you through the plays and the types of plays and stuff. But again, promise, you don't have to watch any, you don't have to read any, you just have to listen to me, who is cool, talk about it and understand why I think it's important and worthwhile for you to know about in terms of its influence and significance. All right, have a good weekend.